All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here with Sophia today. We are happy to have you all here, and we are looking forward to our webinar today. Today, we have three people joining us who worked on a community guide to cumulative impacts, and they translated it fully into Spanish, which is an awesome step. We have with us today Christy Alexson, who's a senior scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She works on cumulative impacts, environmental justice, and public participation and engagement. We have Elizabeth Friedman, who's representing RISE for EJ and SciCan. Elizabeth Friedman's an academic physician in Kansas City, Missouri. Her primary scholarly interest is risk perception and risk communication in the applied context of environmental justice advocacy, community partnerships, with an emphasis on science translation and education. Much of her current scholarship and work in progress derives from a demonstration project, the Science and Community Action Network, and Rise for Environmental Justice. And finally, we have Kathy Curtis joining us from Coming Clean. Kathy co-founded and is the former executive director of Clean and Healthy. She serves as a co-leader of the Cumulative Impacts and Mandatory Emissions Reduction Work Group for the Coming Clean Collaborative. She has 30 years of experience in the environmental health movement. Her leadership has guided enactment of several local, state, and federal policies regarding regulating toxic chemicals. She is executive director at Citizens Environmental Coalition. Thank you all so much for being here. We're delighted to have you. And I'm going to turn it over to you all for your presentation. And we're going to have questions at the end. If you have a question that comes up while they're presenting, feel free to put it in the chat. Otherwise, you can wait and unmute and ask when the presentation's over. All right, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Before we go any much further, we always work to be clear about our development process and our intentions with these presentations and workshops. And so we all aimed for the guide development process to be inclusive of EJ partners and leaders and grassroots groups, as well as making sure it was non-extractive, taking what and not giving. We want our outreach to be similar in that grassroots partners are included and those who participate in presentations are compensated for their intellectual capital and their lived experience, and that they also speak for themselves, which is a fundamental environmental justice principle. We want to develop long-term relationships through these presentations and trainings. So it's not just an event, more of a process. So we're hoping this is a first step, not a one and done experience with us. Next slide. So today we'll do a quick overview of the guide, how we made it, why we made it, what's in it, and then we'll dig into some of the content in the guide, including cumulative impacts basics, how cumulative impacts are defined, quantified, and mapped, the science behind cumulative impacts, some laws and regulations that require cumulative impact assessment, and an example of how to organize for more robust cumulative impacts policies in your community, in your area. Next slide. So the guide was born in the spring of 2022 at a Coming Clean chemical strategy meeting, which initiated a very intentional process to co-develop a community guide for cumulative impacts that's rooted in the lived experiences of overburdened community members and leaders. We wrote a process document, roughly who does what. There was a transparent co-developer scope of work. And for co-developers that required compensation, there were MOUs that provided that. To make the guide, we conducted 6 interviews for 9 people, each an hour and a half long. These co-developers were compensated for their time and received name and organizational recognition. Once we had a draft guide, we went through an iterative review process, including meeting individually with many people to talk through the guide contents. Then the guide went through layout and design and was translated fully into Spanish. And we have released the guide on the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Coming Clean websites, blogged about it, sent it to a variety of listservs, and we're happy to provide this presentation and the materials from today, along with a script. So you can, in turn, train your colleagues and partners. So treat it as a train the trainer. We could have had this done in a month, but we were very inclusive and transparent and bottom up with our process. And I think we ended up with a much better product as a result. Next slide. So the guide has these following 6 sections, starting with a guide to the guide, how to use it, why we made it, when and how, under what, who and how can people use it, under what circumstances. Then the guide includes some basics of cumulative impacts, including quick description of cumulative impacts, what it's like to live with cumulative impacts. So maybe people don't think about that sort of policy wonky term, cumulative impacts. But once they start to go, oh, yes, 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 I'm living with all those things, they're going, oh, I guess we are living with cumulative impacts. The policy roots of cumulative impacts, the racist and biased policies that got us here, why certain communities are considered sacrifice zones. And then we go through some of the existing definitions and some of the screening mapping tools. Next, we describe cumulative impacts, laws, and rules. And then in section 5, we provide tips and resources for organizing around cumulative impacts, including an example to help visualize, implementing an action plan, which we will go through today. Finally, there's an online-only appendix laying out the science of cumulative impacts. We use the guide to prepare this presentation today, so please use it yourself to prepare other presentations that work for your communities and your members and partners. And we turn it over to Elizabeth.
So next we're going to, thank you, excuse me. So next we're going to talk about the basics of cumulative impacts, what the concept is, how it developed over time, and how governments are addressing it. Next slide, please. There are a lot of definitions for cumulative impacts. In the context of today's conversation, we're placing a heavy focus on environmental and environmental health impacts. The content in this slide is to provide you, the audience, with examples of cumulative impacts. One of my preferred definitions comes from Chicago's cumulative impact assessment. I'm just going to read it real quickly. In our daily lives, people can be exposed to pollution through air, water, and land. These exposures add up over time, together with health conditions and social factors that can affect individuals and communities in both positive and negative ways. This is referred to as cumulative impacts. And unfortunately, certain communities experience unequal exposure to multiple environmental, health, and social stressors, and their cumulative impact is then greater. So for the purposes of this talk, it's important to note that cumulative impact is often also used as a scientific concept. And we're advocating that cumulative impact be assessed and integrated into decision-making, by politicians, for example, at the community level, like around land permitting. So environmental protections and regulations are not enacted and implemented that way as of now. In the US, generally, we regulate or attempt to reduce pollutants in the environment in a way that's really isolated and siloed. So, for example, there are rules and activities around one pollutant in the air for one category at one facility. So sometimes there are regulations for multiple facilities, but a protective and holistic approach to environmental protection isn't commonplace. And cumulative impacts is an approach that is supported by community experiences and scientific study. So experience and data and research. A lot of local and state governments have begun enacting requirements to complete cumulative impact assessments to inform their environmental permitting processes. The National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, for example, follows and posts cumulative impacts bills that are proposed around the nation. So this is a map from 23 where bills have been proposed. Next slide, please. Okay. Before we go into other content, it's really important that we point out the fact that communities of color and communities with low wealth are the ones that are predominantly overburdened with pollution sources. And this isn't by accident. There are a lot of examples of biased and racist policies. One of them was redlining, which hopefully you all have learned about. And there have been other blockbusting discriminatory loan practices, etc. And the policies were implemented in some places decades ago, but we still see the impacts today. So our current environmental regulatory system isn't set up to address injustice. And you can see that on this slide. Here, there's a map of redlining in Minneapolis from the 1940s. And then on the next two to the right, these are more updated maps with data on income and race and air pollution density. So you can see communities of color or of less economic means reside closer to more pollution and polluting facilities. And it's not unique to Minneapolis, it's observed around the nation. Next slide, please. So based on the evidence of human experience with pollution, health and social factors, we can think of cumulative impact assessments as potentially including the components in this slide. The more of these components that are included, the more comprehensive an assessment would be. There are overarching categories of topics to look for in an assessment and definitions, and these can work as a checklist to review bill language or for assessments. So for example, you may receive an assessment that's called a cumulative impact assessment, and in reviewing it, you'd look for inclusion of more than one type of pollution source, like highways, factories, and landfills, and then also where and how the impacts are felt. Next slide, please.
So I'll take over for a little bit. We're going to go into defining, quantifying, and mapping cumulative impacts now, and the current practice of how community burdens are visualized and mapping and so forth. Hold on, let me see if I can get this forward. It was going perfectly and now I can't. Okay, there we go. Awesome. So these are some definitions. There are a variety of definitions of cumulative impacts. Some include the health and differing susceptibility of populations, like the Louisville Charter, California Centers for Disease Control, and some are mainly focused on environmental pollution, like Minnesota. They vary, the definitions vary in inclusion of factors related to environmental exposure, social factors, and health conditions and impacts. The city of Chicago, which thank you, Elizabeth read, wrote theirs in a more conversational way. And some, like the European Union, include the concept of both positive and negative factors. In the guide, we went through some definitions and determined, based on multiple readings of the definitions and so forth, if they reflected those components that were in the previous slide. And, that's set up as like an exercise, and it's a good exercise to do if you have a definition sent to you or proposed to you in looking for, how holistic that definition is and does it fit your purposes. So this is the EPA, the US EPA definition of cumulative impacts. Right now it's still on their website. The wording is highly technical and not necessarily meaningful to people who are not directly involved in the work. But we can see that the definition has the term stressors, which means activities or actions that pose harm. And we can see the words chemical and non-chemical. Non-chemical refers to human health harms like that aren't chemicals, like radiation, biological and infectious agents, or the health harms we've been talking about related to exposure to racism and living in poverty. So in another word, maybe the inclusion of social determinants of health. At this point in the world, many of the federal tools that are linked in the community guide have been taken off of federal websites in this new administration. Fortunately, analysts and researchers have come together to recast these tools. A good place to find some of the screening and mapping tools is on the website screening-tools.com. Hopefully you can see that in front of you. And you can, on that website, groups have recast the EJ screen. And in EJ Screen, it was formerly an EPA tool. You can select multiple pollutant, health, and socioeconomic stressors and see how they distribute in your area or in an area you're working in. Maps like EJ Screen would not be possible without the US Census, which is the largest wartime civic mobilization effort in the US. It is not perfect, but I cannot imagine this work without it. And I'm kind of bringing up the US Census here because the Census Scientific Advisory Board was, which is a federal advisory board that provides advice to the Census Bureau, was recently rescinded. And it's not a timely thing for that to happen because the US Census needs to start doing modeling and estimation in 2026. So it's something to pay attention to. But back to our topic, most existing cumulative impacts and environmental justice mapping tools are based on what's called census geographies. So they're kind of like Russian dolls, where the whole country is the largest census geography, and then counties within that, and then census tracts within that, which are around 10,000 people live, census blocks within that, where around 4,000 people live, and then blocks, which you can think of as a city block. Data from specific locations, like health data and individual air pollution measurements, fall within or out of these geographies. So you can count or average data within these geographies and pair them with other information that's gathered in the US Census and compare between. That's kind of the underlying concept of most screening mapping tools for cumulative impacts or environmental justice. We're going to transition a little bit to the science and methods of cumulative impacts. Some of the visuals in the guide may be helpful for you to communicate the ideas behind cumulative impacts to your community and people you work with. So please use them, credit us, but please use the visuals in this guide. And so the first one is a little bit about how pollution travels in the environment, depending on the type of pollution. Pollution moves through the environment from land to air, from soil to water. And as we've mentioned previously, pollution is not regulated like that. It's regulated through laws directed at specific environmental media, like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. But chemicals don't follow that delineation very well. Air pollutants, deposit onto land and water surfaces. Surface water can be a source of pollution to the air, to sediments. And so we think about that in cumulative impacts. For example, the air standard for lead. Does it reflect lead that deposits onto land and water surfaces? Does it reflect exposures from leaded water pipes and older house paint, as an example of thinking in a way that would reflect cumulative impacts, parts of cumulative impacts? So this next slide, people are exposed to hazardous chemicals and pollution from a variety of sources. The chemicals that we are exposed to in drinking water and air pollution and in our food, they may not all be the same chemical, but they can impact the same system of the body and cause additive or, joint harm. For example, there might be a brominated solvent from a factory, like in this picture, and trichloroethylene in the drinking water, and both might impact the immune system. And put that together with a pesticide that impacts the immune system, and you can just see the need for cumulative impact assessment. It's a way to reflect actual human exposures. So on this slide, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about one of our co-developers, and she's taught us a lot. In fact, in the last workshop, she was not able to present in the presentation because she was sitting in a hospital next to a community member who she works with, who is a farm worker. And this farm worker in their career is exposed to multiple pesticides as a part of their occupation. They were very sick with impacts to the immune and endocrine system, to their immune and endocrine system. And both of these health impacts are associated with some individual pesticide exposures, but people aren't exposed, especially with with lots of chemicals, but people aren't exposed to an individual pesticide. Pesticides come in mixtures, and farm workers work in a variety of different locations. And so their organization have struggled to be successful in legal cases because of that inability to track one chemical exposure to one health effect. So our very reality makes it challenging to get that type of compensation or realization. Another thing that's really important to talk about at this stage about farm workers is that, farm workers are mobile. They move around for their occupation and where they live. And so those census geographies that I was talking about, we'd have to think really differently to make sure that those screening tools reflect the lives of farm workers. And so generally in cumulative impacts, we want to think about who is being protected and who is not being protected, and or who is reflected in an assessment and who is not being reflected in an assessment. Okay. This image came straight from the interviews we did with co-developers. It was not something that I had thought of in working in this field. So some communities are exposed in multiple ways throughout the life cycle of an object or a widget or something. And this person used plastic as an example. So, so we can think about oil might be extracted from the earth, and then there's petroleum processing, there's fabrication to make that plastic into a shape that's transported, and then that plastic thing might be sold back to people in a dollar store or something like that. And that plastic thing might have chemicals on it that are going to could impact that person. Then they're collected and again transported, and waste is disposed of, sometimes all within the same community. And so this is another important concept in cumulative impacts that we worked through in the guide. Okay, so we're going to talk about non-chemical stressors, which is a mouthful. It just means anything that's a stressor or could pose harm that isn't a chemical. And this is a paper on non-chemical stressors where they looked at the literature, so that N, or the number of studies they saw that looked at each a variety of different types of non-chemical stressors. And non-chemical stressors can act indirectly with chemicals and directly. Let's go through an example. First, indirectly. So they can act together in the environment to pose more harm to people. Like, for example, more violence in a neighborhood might mean people are less active outdoors, might mean people's respiratory system could be less healthy, meaning more susceptible to air pollution. And non-chemical stressors can also, there's evidence that non-chemical stressors can also act very directly, where someone living in poverty and under the stress of living in poverty, meaning stressful, chronic stress, trying to make gas payments, heating payments, food payments, and so forth, creates chemicals in a body that can worsen impacts to pollution exposures like air pollution. And another part of the science is, currently when federal, state, and local governments attempt to reduce toxic chemical exposures through regulations, they use information from risk assessment. These risk assessments are mainly based on animal models for toxicity testing. The results from these animal models then are used to develop a, quote, acceptable level of risk to determine a toxicity value, which in turn, those are intended to inform pollution control, operational limits, permit limits, and the like. So uncertainty factors are used when there's, to make these toxicity values more stringent in the face of uncertainty, like maybe extrapolating from an animal to a human, or if there's not enough data to make a determination. Uncertainty factors make toxicity values lower, so less of a chemical would be needed to exceed that toxicity value. And just keeping in mind that the human population is much more variable than controlled animal models, a lot of folks in this field are saying that there ought to be an uncertainty factor for human variability, different susceptibility, and so forth, to make to make these risk assessments a little more reflective of reality. And this is one component in cumulative impacts and highly reliant on the existing system of traditional risk assessment, which of itself has been shown to be underprotective of human health. So something to consider. Now Elizabeth is on.
Okay. Okay, so now we're going to move into talking about some of the laws and rules and bills that have been proposed and enacted. Many cumulative impact laws take the experiences of communities, so the real life experience, and the scientific findings together and attempt to write requirements to reduce chemical exposures in light of the mutual information. So California was one of the first states to do law-based work that used cumulative impacts in decision making. Back in the mid-2000s, they conducted an open process to develop a tool that they called the Calimbira screen, which is worth looking at if you have not seen it. It pulls together data on health and pollution and socioeconomic factors. And then they use the screening tool to make decisions about where to prioritize funding and in programs or interventions. And they use the phrase cumulative impacts in this work because the tool includes some, of course not all, environmental, social, and health stressors and burdens. Next slide, please. So cities passed resolutions for permitting, for example, and ordinances for zoning to force decision-making take into consideration cumulative impacts. There were several places have done this. Some of the first to do so were in New Jersey and Delaware. Next slide, please. About 7 or 8 states now have laws requiring cumulative impacts to be considered in the permitting process, and several have some pending. There's a hyperlink at the bottom of the screen for the Tishman Center for the Environment and Design. They have a great set of research products that track enacted laws and rules, including spreadsheets that you can play with. So we highly recommend checking out that resource. Next slide, please. And I'm passing the mic.
Kathy, you're up, I think. Are you there? I don't hear.
Sorry.
Oh,
Sorry
there you
about
are.
that.
There you are. Awesome.
Here I am. So this is my favorite part. Let's move into talking about organizing around cumulative impacts, which is really where the rubber meets the road in enactment and implementation and enforcement. So within the Community Guide to Cumulative Impacts, there's an example in how to organize. Let's talk through a possible organizing approach. Okay. So slide 27. Next is, what are your targets? You may need to identify targets, and those can vary widely in terms of what their constituency is, but basically they're the people who have the power to give you what you want. Okay, so it might be a local council member, it might be a air quality review board, it might be a state legislature, it might be the industry in your community itself that's polluting, but that's, you identify your targets. They're the people you need to influence to achieve your goals. So a lot of times they're elected officials, but there's a simple table in the guide that cues you to identify. It's called a power map. And that's how you figure out whether your targets are allies, are sort of neutral, they never heard of it, you don't know where they stand, it's a question mark, or whether they're going to be opponents, okay? Then we've provided examples to fill in, describing why they might be an ally or an opponent, what relationships already exist with them, how much power they have to influence the outcome, sort of on a scale of 1 to 10, and plans for next steps. And then you build your case. This requires determining what cumulative impacts is for your community. So this may mean choosing or developing a definition, but you can also use the definitions in the guide or look for others. Sometimes in digging into definitions, it's helpful to first underline what may seem important keywords. It's helpful to go through and check which components of a cumulative impact assessment the definition includes. And we provided a table of this exercise in the guide in Table 2 on page 8. You may also want to determine how and when to show where your community and others in the city or state experience cumulative impacts. Communities can use screening and mapping tools for this, and the guide in section 3 provides a primer and a description of several mapping tools that could serve this purpose. This could also mean having community members write or tell their stories. You can make a quick video and describe their neighborhood and experiences. Very compelling, that kind of storytelling. The next step, slide 30, yep, in applying an action strategy may be drafting model legislation. There's at least 7 laws to use, as Elizabeth noted, in drafting model legislation, and many bills that are still up for grabs. And they should evolve over time. It's hard to be the first. You have to make sure that you've moved the ball without doing any harm, and then others can build on and strengthen those policies. So we go through some sections of the early cumulative impact laws, and we'll go through them now. So we summarized 6 of the state cumulative impacts laws in tables and summarized their public participation and engagement requirements into separate tables. So the information that we summarized in these tables includes how decisions are made, statute language that requires decision-making based on either requiring no additional stressors or burdens, no impact to stressors and burdens that are already higher elsewhere, a level of cumulative risk, considering a report, and a substantial adverse impact, where substantial will be defined during the rulemaking process. We let folks know what the rulemaking status was and what the law applies to. For example, remediation, initial permits, etc. Some communities advocate for specific types of facilities to be included. So in addition to what is included in permitting rules, such as distribution warehouses, mines, natural gas plants, sewage treatment plants, etc. This will depend on the needs of the community. The table also includes which agency is implementing the law. Exemptions are important, so we included them in the table. If an exemption is specifically called out in the bill, some states allow exemptions from the law if facilities enter into community benefits agreements, and some states have a compelling public interest exemption, and at least one state has an emission rate increase minimum. Finally, we describe where the law applies. Most state laws apply in overburdened or EJ areas. Minnesota, for example, applies to 3 metro areas and a 1-mile buffer around those EJ areas. Next slide. Cumulative impacts bills for permitting include requirements for enhanced public participation and engagement. People who are the most affected are able to participate in the decision-making process. So let's use Connecticut as an example here. Connecticut has a pretty specific and explicit public participation and engagement requirements. A public participation plan is required from the proposer, reviewed by the agency. An agency must identify a time and place for an informal public meeting. Note the word informal. The meeting location must be convenient for the residents of the community. The agency must publicize the informal meeting using reasonably visible signage in languages spoken by 15% of population and posted online. Notify by mail all residents within a half-mile, a quarter-page ad in a newspaper in area affected, and any other local paper in the Monday issue of a daily or any day in a weekly or monthly newspaper. Very explicit and granular. The agency must provide a public participation report with responses to concerns and questions, both written and verbal, and any resultant changes to the proposed activity. Video recordings of the informal public meeting with submission of the recording to the department. And the law defines meaningful, which can be a very subjective word, public participation. Well, let's take a cumulative impacts bill that was submitted in Michigan, just as an example. This law applies beyond air permitting. It applies to both new construction permits and renewal of operating permits. Very important. The agency is required to provide a public list of overburdened areas that are determined using race, ethnicity, national origin, tribal and indigenous populations, people under age 5 and over age 64, and socioeconomic status, and any other indicators included in the Centers for Disease Control Social Vulnerability Index. This is an example of something that's no longer on the federal website, but it is on screening-tools.com. Applicable facilities are required to submit an environmental justice impact statement, including pollution and pollution source information, socioeconomic data, existing health and public health conditions, etc. The agency makes the decision based on considering the environmental justice impact statement and determining whether or not the impacts from the permitted pollution would be discriminatory. Note that the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council recommendations, including disproportionate or discriminatory consideration with cumulative impacts assessments and decisions. There are exemptions based on air emissions and remedial actions by the facility. So always look to the exemptions. Slide 34. So building decision maker support. In the guide, we go through some steps in building decision maker support, which you will set up once you identify your likely supporters and targets. Some actions include setting up in-person meetings with potential allies in the city or state legislature. Reminder, these are your elected representatives. Their job is to represent you and to hear you out. In this part, it helps to have general agreement around what type and some aspects of the policy you're pushing for, at least policy elements, if not completely cooked policy language. In addition to meetings with individual elected officials, you could organize a panel or a listening session, a breakfast briefing, a toxics tour, a meet and greet event. You can invite everyone in the city council or everyone in the city council who is neutral or an ally to hear a community presentation, panel style, or on how you are experiencing cumulative impacts. Remember to end every meeting with a very clear ask, a very clear push for a particular outcome, and a concrete next step. Follow-up is everything. Slide 35. In communicating and storytelling tips, we describe and provide resources for writing letters to the editor, letters to elected officials, sign-on letters to your targets, how to amplify your voice, social media campaigns, and how to provide public comments and public testimony. So this is where you keep your, then maintaining a drumbeat. That's the part that requires ongoing, concerted testimony and effort. So it's where you keep up your energy, you keep holding meetings, informing more people, bringing in new allies, implementing social media campaigns, etc. It's important. It takes resources and energy. So hopefully part of that effort at that point is building a deeper bench.
Okay.
And there we go. Back to Elizabeth.
Sorry. So in the interviews, a lot of people brought up barriers and challenges, many of which Kathy's really pointed out pretty clearly here. So the guide includes a table of barriers and solutions in the organizing section. Next slide, please. So this is part of the barriers and solutions table, and content, again, was mostly provided by community interviews. At a personal level and working with RISE and SciCan locally here, I've seen challenges would include location of meetings during the day, at a police station in a community full of immigrants. That's not conducive to people showing up when they're at work and or feeling intimidated. Another example would be, for example, community groups have had to make several requests before enforcement happens. And likewise, when permitting changes are being presented around local ethylene oxide pollution, for example, the permitting changes weren't made public until community members found out and pushed the state to do so. Public hearings were not scheduled or made public again until community groups pushed for that to happen. And this speaks again to the importance and really challenges around public participation. Also in the tables are some, common pitfalls by state agencies like those I mentioned, and then some false narratives and accurate portrayals as well. Next slide, please. And Kathy, I'll leave it to you to provide closure.
Sorry. Ah,
We can hear you. That's our presentation.
yeah, that's our presentation. Sorry, I couldn't find those last piece. That's our presentation, and we welcome, as we said initially, ongoing conversation with SOPHIA around this. Consider us a resource. We're happy to do more in-depth presentation on any portion of that, the science, the policy, the organizing, any of the pieces. If that's appropriate, where you have like a work group or a subgroup subcommittee that does that kind of work. Stakeholder engagement, rapid response around policy, whatever the case may be, we're there. And now we'll open it up to questions or reflections.
Right.
Before we go I wanted to say the word cloud here is a representation of all of the words people said in the interviews. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll put the link to the community guide from the Coming Clean website and the UCS website in a second.
Great. Someone asked if the slides were going to be shared at the end. Great. So we'll share slides. We're recording this. I'm going to put it on our YouTube channel, and I can send out an email to everyone who registered with the slides and the recording link, so you can go back and enjoy your leisure. All right, there's a link to the guide. That's fantastic. There was a question earlier.
Yeah, Susan Buchanan
Yeah.
asked a question when Christy was speaking. I'm a little surprised to see the term. Dr. Buchanan, if you want to ask, feel free. Otherwise, I can read it.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I guess I was assuming that that's figure 1A is in the guide. I'm actually looking right now to see if it's here. The term, I think it was legacy pollutants. Maybe it's not in the guide. Okay, if it's not, never mind. That is a term that kind of makes me cringe every time I read it, because it's the EPA uses it, and I don't think communities know what it means. So, but I don't see it in the guide, so never mind. Maybe you don't use it there.
It might be in the appendix in the science and methods. So I could have made it in.
On a term note,
Otherwise, great work. I love it. Thank you so much for the presentation.
I will say I was heartened to hear so many words that I just had to scrub out of a grant being submitted to the government. So SOPHIA is a lovely place to continue to use words like environmental justice and equity, community engagement. It's all great to hear that it's happening. All right, someone else asks, Madeline asks, I'm part of an organization working on the Cumulative Impacts Ordinance in Chicago. I'm curious what people said about their experiences of opposition and how best to navigate these experiences or interactions. Did you hear much about opposition to this type of work?
We did. There's a variety of opposition. Part of it we heard. I'm not sure which part I'm accurately portraying as we heard, and which part in other parts of this work I've heard. But so I will just say generally, but we've heard, the situation where there more people in opposition showing up than there are people who support. That's always an issue. There's the belittling issue. There was a pretty organized effort in opposition to the Albuquerque Cumulative Impacts bill, opposition by a number of different larger organizations, including, I was surprised, the newspaper. And so, yeah, I will let the other presenters
Yeah, if I could speak to this. Part of the problem that Chrissy just highlighted is the employing of surrogates. Like they get people that are not perceived as the chemical industry or, the bad guy, the oil industry, like the local university, or, they get whoever gets to them first and pitches them in a particular way, can often create fears or concerns in that body, that constituency. And certainly the inside messaging that they use, which I'm sorry, it even resonates with people of all political stripes, is, oh, that's too hard. That's going to cost too much money. You shouldn't have to do that. That's mean. And there's always this implication, and it's impossible to fully assess all of the cumulative impacts just by the nature of the word cumulative. It means everything. Lead falling from the sky from, jet fuel combustion. It's impossible to think of everything. Which obviously we need to start somewhere, and we have to commit to continuous improvement and, evolve towards zero. But that's a big argument, is you can't do it. It can't be done. It's too hard. It costs too much money, which resonates with certain agencies and governmental bodies. Also, the implication there is if you don't get it perfect, we'll sue you. You will be sued. And you just got to assume you will be sued. Albuquerque is being sued right now because they were successful. That's their last, place. If you get it passed in one house, they go to the other. If you get it passed in both houses, they stampede to the governor's office. If they get it passed there, if it gets enacted, they will stampede over to the regulating body, the Department of Environmental Protection of whatever, and try to weaken the regulations. If they fail there, then they sue. It's the playbook. Sorry, didn't mean to go on and on. Raquel's got her hand up.
Hi. I had a kind of couple of related questions. Well, first, thank you for the presentations because they were really informative and helpful. I heard you all mention at the beginning that you intended this session to be kind of a train-the-trainer. So I wanted to ask you, in terms of you're sharing some resources, are we free to use them if we are doing any sort of educational activities? That's kind of part one. And part two of my question is, because of the work I do, or like I can't do really advocacy, but I can do education. And so I feel like a huge chunk of your presentation is purely educational. There's a tiny bit that may or may not be, it depends on the way it's framed, but a huge chunk of it is. And so I also wanted to kind of hear from you what type of efforts are going on in terms of spreading the word, say in high schools when kids have their AP environmental science classes, or in colleges, for example, and of course also professional settings in terms of public health, etc.
First answer, the train the trainer part, I plan on sending out the slides after this presentation, including the script. And so, I mean, we all went off script, and that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to personalize what we're saying. And so, yeah, I plan on giving that. And yes, please use the guide, please use the script, the words, whatever. credit us. This is supposed to be a resource to keep moving this forward. We have not
The
been.
credit you part, Christy, was actually kind of what I wanted really to ask, because I'm a Climate for Health ambassador for Eco America. So whenever I present anything using their materials, I should and do cite them, and actually some of the slides have their logos, etc. So I do feel it's very important to acknowledge where you're getting your materials from. So if you could provide some sort of language that we can use if using your materials, I think that would be super helpful.
We could also co-present with folks if they had a panel style. We could offer co-presenters for a train the trainer, if that facilitated doing them, for sure.
And if you wouldn't mind, Raquel, would you email me? I think you have my email. Just an example of the language you're looking for. We have not been asked to do that, so I want to make sure we get you what you want.
Ready?
Yeah. And
I don't have an example. I'm just wanting to make sure that whatever I say is the appropriate thing to say. And because you guys come from 3 different organizations, so, like with Eco America, it's very easy. Or when I do stuff for APAJ, I just say APAJ, like it's super easy, right? But you guys are from 3 different organizations, and I'm learning this through SOPHIA, a 4th. So just trying to come up with a way of, have a line and say, acknowledgements. This comes from. I feel like as the compensation aspect that Kathy mentioned at the very beginning, which I think is really critical, acknowledging where our content comes from, I think it's also very important because it saves time. Like there's no point in me preparing a slide that you guys have already taken time preparing if I'm going to say the same thing just using a different visual. That's a waste of time. Like I should spend that time doing other stuff. But if I'm doing that, I should acknowledge you. That's kind of where I'm coming from. It's being able to plagiarize without really plagiarizing.
There is a visual in the guide of everybody's branding and names and contact information, so that's possible too.
It's in the slide deck too.
Thanks, Raquel.
And the kids stuff, like teaching in schools, for example, like we do for the climate change kit that APJ put out.
We haven't been invited to schools. We'd go. I've done a lot of high school stuff. I love that. I have not done this in high school.
So I think it might be an interesting idea creating some sort of lesson plan like they did for the climate and health stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of semi-volunteering to help with that, but awesome. I can't do any advocacy stuff. It would have to be from the lens of educational.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any other questions from anyone? Okay. This has been really great. Like I said, we've been recording this session, so we'll put the recording up and watch it again. We'll share the links. I've captured all of those. We'll share those in an email to everyone who registered. If you liked this, I'd encourage you, I'm going to put the link to SOPHIA's upcoming practitioner workshop and a link to join SOPHIA if you like having a space where you can talk about things that you maybe can't talk about elsewhere. And if you like connecting with other folks who are doing similar work, please join us, join as a member, and join us at the practitioner workshop next month.
I would also add, just feel welcome to have afterthoughts. If you have a question later, they're like, oh, I should have asked this. It would be a pleasure to hear from any or all of you.
Yeah, and I'm happy to help put people in touch. All right. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks for sharing this, SOPHIA. Bye.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.